Forget everything you think you know about the current standoff in the Baltic. What happened in the early hours of Tuesday morning was not a routine reconnaissance flight. It was not a standard NATO exercise. It was a precision strike package delivered against Russian territory with a level of coordination that tells me one thing. This was planned months in advance. And what we are witnessing right now is the activation of contingency plans that were supposed to remain locked in classified vaults in Brussels. At 0347 hours local time, 8 hours after Russia publicly declared it would not back down from its defensive positions in Kaliningrad Oblast, NATO forces executed a coordinated strike operation involving air and naval assets that penetrated Russian airspace and engaged ground-based defense systems. Having spent years in military intelligence, having sat in rooms where these exact scenarios were wargamed with the understanding that execution would mean crossing a threshold we might not be able to step back from, I am telling you now, we are in uncharted territory. Let me walk you through what actually happened, because the official statements coming out of NATO headquarters in Mons and the sanitized briefings being fed to mainstream media outlets are deliberately obscuring the operational reality of what took place. On Monday afternoon, the Russian Ministry of Defense issued a statement that received almost no attention in Western press. The statement was brief, direct, and unambiguous. It announced that Russian forces in Kaliningrad would maintain their current defensive posture in response to what Moscow characterized as provocative NATO exercises along the Polish-Lithuanian border. The statement included specific reference to the deployment of Iskander-M tactical ballistic missile systems and S-400 air defense batteries that had been moved into forward positions within the exclave. This was not bluster. This was operational notification. In military communications, when you announce specific weapon systems by designation, you are signaling capability and resolve to anyone who understands the language. Russia was saying, we are dug in, we are not moving, and we have the means to defend this position. The Western response was immediate, but it came through channels that do not make evening news broadcasts. Intelligence intercepts that I have reviewed through contacts who still have access to classified traffic show that within 2 hours of the Russian announcement, NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe initiated what is called a Redcon 2 posture for specific rapid reaction units stationed in Poland and Lithuania. Redcon 2 means those units moved from routine readiness to a state where they could execute assigned missions within 6 hours. The specific units involved were elements of the Polish 18th Mechanized Division, the Lithuanian Iron Wolf Mechanized Infantry Brigade, and critically, the United States 82nd Airborne Division's 2nd Brigade Combat Team, which had been conducting exercises in western Poland. But the real operational weight came from air and naval assets. The US Gravely, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer equipped with the Aegis combat system, was repositioned from its patrol station in the central Baltic to a position approximately 40 nautical miles northwest of Kaliningrad. Simultaneously, a package of F-35A Lightning II aircraft from the 493rd Fighter Squadron, based at RAF Lakenheath in the United Kingdom, were placed on alert status with tanker support pre-positioned. Stay with me, because what I am about to tell you is where this situation moved from strategic posturing to active combat operations. At 0347 hours local time on Tuesday morning, 8 hours and 13 minutes after the Russian announcement, NATO executed what operational planners call a SEAD package. SEAD stands for Suppression of Enemy Air Defenses. This is not reconnaissance. This is not posturing. This is the opening phase of air operations, designed to degrade an adversary's ability to defend their airspace. The strike package consisted of at least 6 F-35A aircraft approaching Kaliningrad from multiple vectors, supported by E-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft operating from extended range, and coordinated with Tomahawk cruise missile launches from the US Gravely. The F-35s carried AGM-88E advanced anti-radiation missiles, specifically designed to home in on and destroy radar systems. The targeting priorities were Russian S-400 radar installations and Panzer S-1 point defense systems protecting critical infrastructure within the exclave. Now let me explain why this matters in ways that no official briefing is going to address. Kaliningrad is not just another piece of Russian territory. It is a strategic exclave, completely separated from mainland Russia, bordered by NATO members Poland and Lithuania, with the Baltic Sea providing the only access route that does not cross alliance territory. The population is approximately 490,000 people. The military garrison includes elements of the 11th Army Corps, Baltic Fleet naval forces, and some of Russia's most advanced tactical weapons systems, precisely because of its geographic isolation and strategic importance. When you strike Kaliningrad, you are not hitting a border outpost. You are attacking a fortress that Russia has spent decades fortifying, with the explicit understanding that it must be able to defend itself without immediate reinforcement from the mainland in any conflict scenario with NATO. The S-400 Triumph air defense system that was targeted in this strike represents the most capable mobile air defense platform in the Russian inventory. The system's 40N-6E missile has a maximum engagement range of 400 kilometers against aircraft and 60 kilometers against ballistic missile targets. The radar complexes provide search, track, and fire control capabilities that can engage up to 36 targets simultaneously. These are not systems you target unless your intention is to establish air superiority for follow-on operations. Let me be absolutely clear about what targeting priorities like this indicate about operational intent. You do not spend AGM-88E missiles, which cost approximately $1–2 million each, and you do not risk fifth-generation aircraft in contested airspace unless you are preparing the battle space for something larger. The electronic warfare component of this operation tells me that NATO planners understood they were going up against an integrated air defense network that had been specifically configured to counter Western stealth technology. The E-18G Growler aircraft that provided electronic attack support carry the ALK-99 jamming pods and the ALK-227 communication countermeasures set. These systems are designed to blind, confuse, and overwhelm radar networks through a combination of noise jamming, deceptive jamming, and electronic deception techniques. In the operational planning for a mission like this, electronic warfare aircraft establish jamming corridors that allow strike packages to penetrate defended airspace with reduced probability of detection and engagement. The fact that Growlers were committed to this mission confirms that NATO expected significant resistance and took active measures to suppress it. The Tomahawk missiles launched from the US, Gravely, represent a different dimension of the strike package. The Tomahawk Block 4 variant, which is what the Gravely carries, has a range exceeding 1,600 kilometers and can be retargeted in flight through satellite communications. These missiles were not launched at mobile air defense systems. They were launched at fixed infrastructure targets within Kaliningrad. Based on damage assessment imagery that has begun to emerge from commercial satellite operators, at least 3 targets were struck. One was a communications node serving the 11th Army Corps headquarters. Another was a radar installation at Chekhalovsk Air Base. The third was a logistics depot near the town of Gusev that stores ammunition and fuel for ground forces. What this targeting pattern tells me is that NATO was not simply suppressing air defenses for a one-time strike. They were degrading command and control capabilities and logistical infrastructure that would be necessary for sustained defensive operations. Russian response was immediate, but measured in ways that suggest Moscow understood This was a carefully calibrated operation, designed to test response thresholds without triggering full-scale escalation. Within minutes of the strike, Russian forces went to full combat alert across the western military district. Air defense batteries that had not been targeted immediately went active, radiating their search radars and demonstrating that they remained operational. Russian fighters, specifically Su-35S aircraft from the 790th Fighter Aviation Regiment, scrambled and established combat air patrols over Kaliningrad. But critically, Russian forces did not launch retaliatory strikes against NATO targets. They did not engage the NATO aircraft that had already exited the operational area. They did not fire on the US gravely, despite it being well within range of Russian anti-ship missiles. This restraint was not weakness. It was calculation. Before we go any further, I need you to understand the strategic logic that is driving decisions in Moscow right now, because Western media coverage is presenting this as Russian aggression met with justified NATO response, and that framing is completely inverted from the operational reality. Russia views Kaliningrad as existentially important, precisely because it is isolated and vulnerable. Every NATO exercise near its borders, every deployment of additional alliance forces to Poland and the Baltic states, every enhancement of military infrastructure in the region is perceived in Moscow as preparation for a scenario where Kaliningrad could be cut off, besieged, or seized. From the Russian strategic perspective, maintaining credible deterrence in Kaliningrad is not optional. It is the difference between retaining a strategic foothold in the Baltic or accepting encirclement by hostile forces. The decision to announce publicly that Russian forces would not back down from their defensive positions was not improvisation. It was a carefully considered message designed to communicate resolve to NATO decision-makers while establishing a clear position before international audiences. What Russia was saying was, we are not withdrawing under pressure, we are not going to be intimidated by exercises on our border, and we will maintain the means to defend our territory. This is entirely consistent with Russian military doctrine, which emphasizes defensive operations, strategic depth, and the willingness to accept higher risk in defense of core security interests than adversaries might be willing to accept in pursuit of peripheral objectives. NATO's response 8 hours later demonstrates something that should alarm anyone who understands how escalation dynamics work in great power competition. Rather than using diplomatic channels to de-escalate tensions, rather than proposing confidence-building measures or military-to-military communications to reduce misunderstanding, NATO chose to execute a kinetic strike that penetrated Russian airspace, damaged Russian military infrastructure, and killed Russian military personnel. Early casualty reports suggest between 11 and 18 Russian service members were killed in the strikes, with additional wounded. These are not abstract strategic calculations. These are dead Russian soldiers killed on Russian territory by NATO weapons. Keep watching, because what I have not yet explained is why this particular moment was chosen for an operation of this magnitude. The timing is not coincidental. For the past 6 weeks, NATO has been conducting steadfast defender exercises across Eastern Europe, involving more than 90,000 troops, hundreds of aircraft, and dozens of naval vessels. These exercises have been described in official statements as routine readiness training, but anyone who has actually participated in military exercises at this scale understands that they provide cover for operational deployments, pre-positioning of equipment, and the establishment of logistics networks that can support combat operations with minimal additional preparation. The exercises have moved enormous amounts of ammunition, fuel, and spare parts into forward locations in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. They have established command and control relationships and tested communications networks under field conditions. They have rehearsed the exact types of combined arms operations that would be necessary in a Baltic contingency. What happened in Kaliningrad was not a standalone event. It was a demonstration that NATO can execute complex strike operations against defended Russian territory, using the infrastructure and readiness that has been built up under the cover of exercises. It was a message that said, we can strike, we can coordinate air and naval assets, we can penetrate your defenses, and we can do it faster than you can effectively respond. This is signaling through action rather than words, and it is profoundly dangerous because it establishes a precedent that kinetic operations are an acceptable tool of coercion below the threshold of declared war. Let me walk you through what the strategic chessboard looks like right now, because the next moves matter more than anything that has happened so far. Russia faces a decision tree where every option carries catastrophic risk. If Moscow does not respond to this strike, it signals to NATO that operations against Russian territory can be conducted without meaningful consequence. That perception would invite further operations, further testing of boundaries, and progressive degradation of Russian defensive capabilities through repeated strikes. From a deterrence theory perspective, failing to respond to aggression guarantees more aggression. But if Russia does respond with retaliatory strikes against NATO targets, it risks escalation that could rapidly spiral beyond anyone's ability to control. Striking a NATO member state activates Article 5 collective defense commitments. It provides justification for the full mobilization of alliance military power. It transforms a limited engagement into a general war scenario. The options available to Russian decision-makers right now are all variations of terrible. They could execute retaliatory strikes against the specific NATO assets that conducted the Kaliningrad operation, targeting the US gravely, or the air bases that launched the F-35s. This would be proportional response under international law, but would guarantee NATO escalation. They could strike NATO infrastructure in Poland or Lithuania that supported the operation, such as air bases, logistics hubs, or command centers. This would be escalatory, but would demonstrate that Russian territory cannot be struck with impunity. They could execute strikes against NATO member states that did not directly participate in the Kaliningrad operation as a demonstration of resolve. This would be highly escalatory and would risk general war. Or they could absorb the strike, protest through diplomatic channels, and prepare for the long-term strategic competition, while avoiding immediate escalation. What you need to understand about decision-making in Moscow is that Russian strategic culture places enormous emphasis on historical precedent and the lessons of previous great power conflicts. There is deep institutional memory of June 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa despite Stalin's desperate attempts to avoid provocation. There is memory of how Western powers treated Russian weakness in the 1990s, expanding NATO despite assurances to the contrary, and intervening in Yugoslavia over Russian objections. There is memory of the 2008 Georgia conflict, where Russia demonstrated willingness to use military force to protect what it views as core interests. These historical reference points shape how Russian leaders assess credibility, resolve, and the costs of action versus inaction. The worst-case scenario, and I need you to stay with me for this, because it is where the logic of this situation leads, if current trajectories continue, is that we are watching the establishment of a new normal, where limited military operations between NATO and Russia become accepted tools of strategic competition. If NATO can strike Kaliningrad and Russia does not respond in kind, then the threshold for future operations has been lowered. If Russia does respond, and NATO treats that response as justification for expanded operations, then we enter an escalation spiral. If both sides decide they can manage escalation through precise targeting and limited objectives, we end up with ongoing military exchanges that eventually exceed someone's tolerance for restraint. Throughout history, great power wars have started not because anyone wanted general conflict, but because graduated escalation created situations where backing down became more costly than continuing forward. In 1914, nobody wanted World War I, but the mobilization dynamics and alliance commitments created a situation where each power felt it had no choice but to continue down the path that led to catastrophe. What I am watching right now has those same characteristics, incremental decisions, each one seemingly logical in isolation, that collectively create a trajectory toward outcomes that nobody actually wants. The next 72 hours will be critical for determining whether this situation stabilizes or continues to escalate. Watch for Russian military movements in the Western Military District and Baltic Fleet. Watch for changes in alert status for strategic forces. Watch for diplomatic signaling from Moscow about whether they intend to seek de-escalation or prepare for follow-on operations. Watch for NATO repositioning of forces and changes in readiness status. Watch for back-channel communications or lack thereof. The indicators will tell us whether decision-makers on both sides recognize they need to step back, or whether they believe they can manage continued escalation. I have spent decades trying to help people understand how wars start, how they escalate, and how difficult they are to control once the shooting begins. What happened in Kaliningrad is not the beginning of World War III, but it is the kind of event that historians will point to as a critical juncture if this situation continues to deteriorate. We are not in a crisis yet, but we are significantly closer to one than we were 48 hours ago. The decisions being made right now in Moscow, Washington, Brussels, and NATO member state capitals will determine whether we pull back from this edge or continue moving toward it. The reality that no official briefing will address is that both sides now face domestic political pressures that make backing down extremely difficult. NATO cannot appear weak after conducting a strike operation. Russia cannot appear weak after having its territory attacked. The space for compromise shrinks when operations move from rhetoric to kinetic action. This is why military professionals try to maintain channels of communication even during periods of high tension. Why we establish deconfliction mechanisms and crisis management procedures. Those safeguards exist because smart people understand that escalation is easy and de-escalation is hard. What I am telling you is not designed to generate panic. It is designed to generate understanding. We are in a situation where educated awareness of the actual dynamics at play is more important than ever. Official narratives from all sides are going to emphasize justification for their own actions and condemnation of adversary behavior. That framing, while understandable, does not help anyone understand the escalation risks we face. What helps is understanding the operational logic, the strategic calculations, the historical patterns, and the decision trees that leaders are navigating right now. Stay informed. Watch developments closely. Understand that what we are seeing is not an inevitable march toward conflict, but rather a series of decisions that could still be redirected if enough people in positions of responsibility recognize the stakes and choose restraint over demonstration. The coming days will tell us a great deal about whether that wisdom prevails or whether we continue down the path toward outcomes that nobody should want.